Hello everyone, welcome to English 103, Studies in Contemporary Literature. Insofar as, for many of you, I think this might be an introduction to literature, at least at university, I think it might be a good idea to ask ourselves the question, what is literature? What's the point? Why bother? To answer that question, let's go back to 1922 in Paris. A newspaper called L'Intransigeant started to publish in its editorial section a question every week for the citizens of Paris. So one week they asked, what would you do to solve the problem of traffic congestion in Paris today? It's kind of funny to think that about 100 years later, they still haven't figured that out, right? Anyway, one question they asked was this. What would you do if you were told beyond all reasonable doubt that the world is going to come to an end in the next day or two? What would you do? Well, in the following days, people wrote in with their answers. And there were a number of Parisian celebrities who contributed. One of them, Henri Bordeaux, who was a kind of, B-list playwright novelist, wrote in to say that he figured people would just jump into church or jump into bed, one or the other, although he declined to indicate his particular preference. There was a famous occultist and palm reader called Madame Freya, who wrote in pretty much along the same lines, saying that she thought everybody would be so wrapped up in the pursuit of their own appetites and worldly pursuits that nobody would stop to think about the possibility of an extraterrestrial life. Henri Robert, kind of sportsman celebrity, wrote in to say that he would spend his last few hours playing bridge, tennis, and golf. You get the picture. But there was another response from Marcel Proust, often referred to as the greatest novelist of the 20th century. Why don't we have a little look at him here? Here he is, a very dapper-looking figure. We're actually going to read a couple of extracts from his novel In Search of Lost Time. We'll do that in a couple of weeks' time. Anyway, he wrote back to the newspaper in response to their question. And this is what he said. He said, I think that life would suddenly seem wonderful to us if we were threatened to die, as you say. Just think of how many projects, travels, love affairs, studies, our life hides from us, made invisible by our laziness, which, certain of the future, delays them incessantly. But since the cataclysm doesn't happen, we don't do any of it, because we find ourselves back in the heart of normal life, where negligence deadens desire. And yet we shouldn't have needed the cataclysm to love life today. It would have been enough to think that we are humans and that death may come this evening. Let's go back to our question. What is literature? And why bother writing it? Why bother reading it? There are obvious answers, right? There are obvious answers if we use contrast. I'm always going on at my English 100 students, use contrast. It just opens up any question you have. So we can look at scientific writing, we can look at technical writing, look at those texts, legal, and then contrast them with a literary text. What will we see? Well, what we will see is an absence of figurative, symbolic, metaphoric language in scientific writing, which assumes a direct correlation between the word and the thing it describes. An absence of that sort of stuff. I mean, if you are flying a plane, you look at the flight manual, you do not want to see metaphors, right? So there's an absence of that, and of course, in contrast, there's a preponderance of it in literary writing. We have descriptive words, metaphors, similes, and so on. So that's one of the ways we can start to describe what literature is and identify it. Of course, in most literary texts, we will encounter characters. We will have protagonists and antagonists, and these characters will make journeys and discover pitfalls along the way. We can start to describe plot lines and structure in that sense. Usually the setting is symbolic in some shape or form. And we can talk about point of view and different narrative planes. We can talk about first-person narration, limited first-person narration, third-person omniscient, so on and so forth. You're familiar with this, right? Because this is what you did at high school. This is how you can sort of analyze a literary text and how you understand that it is literary. Okay. But that still doesn't really address the question of why bother. And I think that's why I took you to Proust. Because I think that what he's getting at can be extended to literature itself. It is designed to make us see ourselves, the people around us, the world around us, afresh, anew, to stimulate us, to reconsider our lives. And arguably, that's the point. We learn as a result. And the process might not always be enjoyable or amusing. Of course, it can be, and we will be reading things in this course that I hope you do find enjoyable and entertaining. But it might not be that. It might be disturbing. It might be shocking. It might be upsetting. It might make us angry. In fact, looking back at when I was a student, I think sometimes I learned as much, if not more, interacting with the text I really didn't like than the text I did like. I mean, let me tell you now, I almost don't care if you like or don't like something that we read. What matters is, are you learning from it? If you're bored, well, maybe that's your problem. And hopefully you're not going to find the stuff we read boring, although it might be challenging at times. Okay, so we're sort of chipping away at this question, aren't we? What is literature? What's the point of it? Coming up with some answers, I hope, so far. And it kind of leads us to the next question, which is, oh, well, how do we then study it? How do we sort of drill down on the nuts and bolts? And, you know, when we're in high school, we do what I've just been suggesting. You know, we ask ourselves, what's the theme of the story we've read, or the novel we've read, or the screenplay? And then how does character communicate the theme, the plot development, the setting, so on and so forth? Yeah, we can do all of that. But at university, we continue to do that, but we also start to do something different in English studies, which is we start to look at literary texts using literary perspectives, literary theories. Think of them rather like spectacles. So it's like you have a prism and you start to read a literary text through that prism. It might, for example, be Marxist. Okay, so if I am a Marxist literary critic, it really doesn't matter what I read. I will read it for signals, for identifiers that tag into a Marxist perspective. Broadly speaking, I will be looking for some evidence of this economic determinism which Marx sets out for us, this sort of transition from feudal arrangements to mercantile, to early capitalist, to advanced capitalist, to socialist, and ultimately to communist. We would be looking, for example, for evidence in the characterization of alienation and exploitation. We would start to look at how this literary text itself is part of this ideology, this capitalist superstructure ideology. We would sort of advance in that way, and quite irrespective of whether the author intended us to do that. It's irrelevant to a Marxist literary critic whether the author was Marxist themselves. It doesn't matter, right? So that's an example of the sort of thing you might do. And if not Marxism, well, then it could be psychoanalytical, right? So you could do a Freudian reading of a literary text, a Lacanian reading, a Jungian reading, and so on. You could do a feminist reading. You could do a post-colonial reading, a new historicist reading, a structuralist or post-structuralist reading, a deconstructionist reading. Yeah. I teach literary theory at Capilano. I think it's English 207. I've done it many times, and it's kind of a fun course because you just spend a week, with one of these lenses as a class, and you read something and take it in whatever direction it can go. But at the end, we read Shakespeare's King Lear, and we read this single play using all these different perspectives, and it's quite fascinating how the play just sort of opens up like a flower each time, depending upon which prism you're using. So I came to this course, English 103, and I thought, what am I going to do? And I kind of got fed up doing all of that and thought I want to try something different. And I realized that something that's been interesting me for a long time now is the way in which literature, for all the things that we've been saying so far, involves the telling of a story. It involves recounting, retelling something, either the narrator or the character or whatever. This is what we have, isn't it? In nearly all works of literature, I suppose we might exclude some poems, but a lot of poems still present us with character and journey and retelling if it's an epic poem, for example. But yeah, I mean, all the stuff we're going to be reading is involving this process of retelling and recounting. So that takes me to memory. And this course is therefore going to be about literature and memory. And as an adjunct to that, the second part of the course will take us into photography, because of course the photograph is a memory device. That's what we're going to be doing. And if you don't like that, then I guess you need to find another section, right? So let's sort of begin to think about literature and memory. And I will give you, I'll take you to the course outline in a moment, but just bear with me. So I think there are two basic ways in which we can start this process. The first is that we should recognize that a lot of literature treats as a sort of central theme the notion of memory, of remembering something. And this can be characters seeking to recover something from the past, which might be tangible or intangible. So let's give an example. My little boy at the moment is growing up with Pokemon and Bakugan and all that sort of stuff, and then it's going to be Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And here you have characters often in search of hidden powers or rings or swords, or you've got buried treasure somewhere and they're all trying to find. So you've got sort of a tangible thing that somebody's trying to recover, and memories operating in that sense. Or it might be intangible, and you've got characters who are trying to remember or recover an identity, a lost time. Some of you will be familiar with the Jason Bourne films, right? So that's a very good example of what I'm talking about, right? So there you've got a character who is preoccupied with the question of who am I, which connects to the question of who was I. And so now you have a retrieval sort of process operating as central to these films. Okay, so that's one way in which we should address literature and memory as a sort of basic theme of the text itself. But another way is to actually understand that the narrative form itself involves that process of remembering. Think of a fairy tale that begins once upon a time. I mean, that is implied. It may be unwritten, but it's implied in every third person omniscient narrator of a story, once upon a time, and then we have the story. As we go through this course, we will start to pick up some more sort of technical language that will help us to identify different forms of narrative remembering. So, for example, we can make a distinction between syntagmatic narration and paradigmatic narration. So what is syntagmatic narration? I'm thinking of my mother, right? So imagine that she wanted to tell us about something that happened to her last week in the supermarket. I think what she would do, she'd say, you know, I got up at 8:30 in the morning and I brushed my teeth and I went downstairs and I had breakfast and I had a couple of eggs and I did that, and then I put the dog out and I got him back in, and then I got in the car, but then I forgot my keys, so I went back to get my keys. And you're thinking, get to the supermarket, please. You know, and eventually she'll get there and then she'll tell you what happened. And so you have this kind of long build-up, a chronological build-up towards the event. This is syntagmatic description, memory trace like that. Different from my dad, who has a more paradigmatic approach to recounting things. So he might begin by saying, you know, something weird happened in the supermarket to me last week, and it reminded me of when I nearly trod on a snake in the garden the other day. And so what he's doing is, like a helicopter, he's connecting disparate, completely different events so as to describe what happened to him in the supermarket. And so this is a more sort of metaphoric way in which we can remember in narrative. And so we have this very interesting distinction. I'm not for one moment suggesting that one is better than the other. The beauty of syntagmatic narration is the way that it can build atmosphere and ambience on that journey to the supermarket, if you like. I mean, Dickens is wonderful at this, and you know, we can think of many writers similarly. So it's not better or worse, it's just different narrative styles, okay? The point here, I suppose, is that in the telling of a story, we are activating a notion of time, whatever notion that is. But in order to help us here access different literary treatments of time, I want to take us to different brain memory states, if I can put it that way, and start to sort of just draw on a little neuroscience, just to help us find vehicles or metaphors for distinguishing different literary treatments of memory. That may seem a bit weird at the moment, so let me just take you to this little diagram of the brain that we have here, or the limbic system. This is what we will find beneath the neocortex. And there are three actually, but two key areas of the brain here which take us to different memory states. The first that I want to refer to is the amygdala. You can see it on the left here. The amygdala is that part of the brain which evaluates emotional experience. it's that part of the brain that will process the fight or flight impulse that we have. It will trigger, for example, an increasing heart rate or breathing rate so that we can cope, our body can cope in these extreme situations. But for our purposes, it's key because of the way that it processes and evaluates emotional events in such a way as to imprint memory. And so it is that in the amygdala, the more intense the emotion we experience from an event happening, the more ingrained it will become in our memory as an emotional memory. And a bit later in this video, we will look at some literature which will actually demonstrate how that works. But I think at this stage, it will help to understand, it will clarify this if we contrast it with the hippocampus here in the bottom right. On the center here, this kind of seahorse-like shaped thing. And it is in the hippocampus that we start to process a different type of memory. And this is going to be the more episodic, rational, logical memory that will be triggered by visual stimuli and words. And it's interesting that when subjects have damage to that part of the brain, they have a problem forming memories. They have a problem often in creating new memories of events. This is what we call anterograde amnesia. And they can also sometimes have problems in recovering the memories they had before the damage occurred to their brain. And this is what we call retrograde amnesia. But this is how we can sort of deduce that therefore this part of the brain actually does function in this way in terms of fashioning memories. So the other area of the brain I guess I should mention here is top left here, the cingulate gyrus, which becomes active in the processing of senses. So the gustatory, which is taste, the olfactory, which is smelling, tactile, which is touching. This is the part of the brain that processes this. And it becomes important for us when we turn to symbolist literature. We will be reading poems by Baudelaire, for example, which are all about memory traces triggered by a smell or the taste of something. And that's where the cingulate gyrus is active. So the idea that we've got in this course now is that we're going to start distinguishing different types of literature and memory in terms of different brain states. This might be clearer if I take you finally to the course outline. We'll come back to that stuff in a moment. Let's just look at the content here. So yeah, you can see, here we are, week 1, and we'll start to look at texts which take us to emotional memory, and I've described them as predominantly amygdalal texts. It takes us to romanticism and symbolism. And Proust is going to help us because of the way in which he explores emotional memory, amygdalal memory states, and then as a sort of segue or pivot will take us into more hippocampal memory states, and that will take us into week 3 and associative memory and modernism, and that's when we will start to study Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And there'll be a quiz there, but I'll talk to you about that in a second. Shifting from there, we'll start to think about, well, the Jason Bourne question, right? The who am I and who was I? But we're going to do that by reading a play by Oscar Wilde called The Importance of Being Earnest, which is very funny. I hope you will enjoy it. And then we have a rewriting of that play in another play called Travesties by Tom Stoppard. From there, we will start to look at more perhaps complex brain states, memory states. I mean, some of you, particularly those of you who are studying neuroscience, may be laughing and think, oh my God, it's way more complicated than this. Yeah, it is. Of course it is. Particularly if we start thinking about dreaming and what's happening there. So this is where we will start to explore surrealist literary texts, taking us into this different notion of brain memory activity. And then we will turn to figurative and mythic memory, because of course memories are not just things that we have inside our brains as discrete unitary agents. They're shared memories. We have collective memories, don't we? So this is something that takes us into a more postmodern literary treatment of memory. And we'll read Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Garden of Forking Paths. All right, that gets us to the midterm, more on that in a moment. And then we'll shift into the second part of the course, which is where we start to think of a particular kind of phenomenon of memory, which is the photograph. And the more I researched this, the more fascinated I became, because the invention of the photograph, and I guess we're talking about 1832, 1833, profoundly changed the world, changed us as human beings. I mean, it's not just its application in science, sociology, and so on. Philosophically, it is a huge turning point in our history, because it changed our notion of veracity, of what constituted a truth, a provable truth. Suddenly we have a photograph, right? And then when you start to go down the line and look at the way in which today, with the digital image, we can manipulate it so easily, we sort of pitch into what might be called an epistemological crisis, and it will become fascinating in that sense, but we'll get to that. The short stories that I'm going to ask you to read, Calvino, Updike, Ozick, and Carver, take us to different experiences of that photographic process. So it might be a focus on what it is to be a photographer, or what it is to be the photography, and all those points in between. We arrive at week 10, or somewhere thereabouts, with our final novel, which is going to be by Jonathan Safran Foer, called Everything is Illuminated. I think it's fair to say that nearly all my students love this book. It is a truly astonishing, very funny at times, but also very moving novel. And the reason I chose it is because it brings everything together that we will have been looking at. In fact, this course, the conception of this course, or inception of it, was the reading of this novel. And that's what got me thinking about all these other things. And it really comes together, I hope, really well at the end. Okay, so that's what we're doing, guys. I guess what I should do now is take you into a little bit of housekeeping. So let's just push back up here. I've already sent this through to you, okay, to your emails. So you already know this is fully online, this course. Just look at this bit in bold. Students will have access via eLearn to pre-recorded lectures, which are mandatory course viewing. That's the kicker, all right? So, you know, if we were in the classroom, I would be saying to you that you need to attend class. It's compulsory. And you must now think of these videos as compulsory, however painful that might be. I guess the beauty of this format is that you can break them up, right? You don't have to sit there and suffer for an hour and 10 minutes every time. You can sort of do this in little fragments or replay or whatever. But what I would say is that if you don't follow the videos pretty carefully in this course, you can very quickly get lost, because we're going to be feeding in a fair amount of sort of technical language as we go through, and you know, you need to stay up, stay with this. Okay, the required texts here, I think, should be available online to you in some shape or form, and do work with the bookstore for that if necessary. I'm not too concerned about the editions that you get, all right? I will be giving you page numbers, but most of the time you'll be able to follow where I am. Shouldn't be too much of a problem. Office hours, you email me, I get back to you. That's pretty much how this has been working. If absolutely necessary, we'll find a time to FaceTime and talk if we need to, okay? The rest of this you can read in your own time. And I guess I should now take you to this bit. Right, so you can see the assignments. So a word about the midterm, because I imagine that some of you are freaking out about it already. You will be asked to write 2 short essays in the midterm. One of them on the novel by Joyce, and the other one on the other things, other texts that we've looked at in the first 4 or 5 weeks. I will, of course, give you a handout and clear instructions about what's coming. But let me perhaps make this general comment, because it might ease your concerns. If you simply regurgitate in your midterm what I say in the forthcoming videos, you use the same examples I give, the same quotes that I give, and you do that in a grammatically correct, well-organized essay, or 2 essays, you'll be fine. In fact, you'll be more than fine. You'll get a decent grade. You'll get a BB+. I mean, it would be that easy. Okay, no matter how complex it seems, it will be that easy. All you've got to do is watch the bloody videos and make a few notes, and you'll be fine. But you won't get an A. So those of you watching this now who want the top grade, you will need to add to what I say in the forthcoming videos. How will you do that? You will do research, some of your own research, and bring in some quotes. And this is how you really will impress me and get to these top grades, assuming, of course, it's all grammatically correct too. So hopefully that puts your mind somewhat at rest. I say exactly the same thing about the final essay. Okay, so the final essay will be 2 short essays, one on the novel Everything is Illuminated, and another short essay on the short stories about photography. Okay? And the same comments apply there. In both cases, you're going to have 4 to 5 days to write it at home. So you don't have the stress of having to do this in an hour and 20 minutes in class, which is what used to be the case when I did this. So hopefully, yeah, challenging, but hopefully you just watch the videos, it's going to be fine. Quizzes, easy peasy. Probably the easiest 20% you're going to get at Capilano, because they're not looking for interpretation or anything like that. It's just basic factual questions, usually 1-word answers, which will show me that you've read the text. So there will be a quiz coming up on the novel by Joyce, a portrait of the artist as a young man, and there will be a quiz on that final novel, Everything is Illuminated. And there will be 2 more quizzes on 2 other things. And I might not even tell you in advance because I want to make sure you read the bloody stuff, right? But if you have read the stuff, you will find the quizzes very easy. This, I promise you. The photographic journal, again, easy. This is due right at the end. And this is more like a creative writing assignment. So I'm going to ask you to choose a photograph, maybe compare and contrast it with others, and you'll feed in some of the technical language that we will learn about how to look at photographs. But really, this will be just me eliciting your own personal views about, the photograph you're discussing. So as a creative writing assignment, dare I say, easy. Shouldn't be a problem, and you'll put together some PowerPoint, or I don't really care what you do, how you do it, just get something through to me. But again, I'll give you a handout, all right, telling you exactly what you need to do for that when we get down to there. Okay, one final thing I just want to mention before I push on, and it's to do with this first novel we encounter, Joyce's Portrait of the Artist. So you've got, 2 weeks to get going on that. The other stuff, don't worry about. I'll just send it to you as little handouts and we'll read it in the video. So that's your homework, all right? You need to be reading that novel ready for when we start it, because there will be a quiz. Excuse me. And here's perhaps for some of you the good news. You don't need to read chapter 5, which is the final chapter of the novel. That may sound rather odd, me saying that. Understand that this is a very episodic novel. Each chapter is almost like a standalone island. It's not building up to a climax in the way that perhaps other things you've read do. So it's not as though missing out in chapter 5, you're going to miss out on the climax. So it doesn't kind of work like that. I would love it if you did read chapter 5. But it's very philosophical and not absolutely necessary for this course. The first 4 chapters are going to be everything I need for us to explore associative memory, which is the point. Okay, so to repeat, get that ready for week 3, but you don't need to read chapter 5 if you don't want to. Okay? You have any questions about that, then just email me, right? And I'll get back to you. Sorry about that. What else should I say at this point? I treat you like adults, of course I do, all right? So I'm not going to be mother hen here. I'm not going to be chasing you. It almost doesn't matter to me whether you pass or fail. Why should it? But I'm going to do my best. And that means I'll do my best to help you. If you have any questions en route, of course, just drop me a line and we'll try and sort it out. And if you have problems with deadlines, just, run it past me and hopefully I can help you there. I'm not going to be a problem in your life unless I detect some kind of rudeness. But I don't think that's going to happen, right? So we should be fine. All right, now, just finally in this video, I want to just start picking away at this thing here, romanticism. And this begins our study of emotional memory, amygdalal text. What do we think of when we say romanticism? As a sort of artistic literary movement, what are you thinking of right now? Do you have any dates in mind? What sort of period are we looking at? Well, of course academics argue about this. They argue about everything, but you probably would be thinking about 1770-ish up until 1850-ish, give or take a bit at either end. That's the kind of time period we're looking at, in many ways, it helps to think of it as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, to the increasing sense that human beings were becoming mere economic units of production. It's a reaction against that. It's a reaction where we can contrast it with the realist literary novel, something, for example, by Zola. He wrote a very famous novel called Germinal, which is about the exploitation of workers in the coal mines of northern France. I mean, that's a classic, realist text about exploitation and suffering. Romanticism is a kind of reaction to that, reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and a reaction to the realist novel in its form. So we have a focus on the imagination, a focus on the individual, a focus on childhood innocence and childhood memories, a focus on nature and identification with nature. That actually leads us to what's called the pathetic fallacy. This is a term that John Ruskin came up with to actually criticize Romanticism. It's where you encounter references. I know the clouds looked gloomy and ominous. This is a kind of personification or anthropomorphism of natural phenomena, which is associated with Romanticism. A fascination also with the sublime. The sublime is that awe-inspiring encounter with nature that exhilarates us and terrifies us. So all of these are the sort of elements we might think of as romantic, and we will find in Romantic literature. But another key element is its tendency towards emotional memory and highly wrought emotional states. It takes us to Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who died in 1778, so just at the sort of beginning of the Romantic period. There he is. You may know of him because of this. This is The Social Contract, a key philosophical text in the history of classical Republican political thought. I mean, here's a nice passage he comes up with. That men are actually wicked, a sad and continual experience of them proves beyond doubt. But all the same, I think I've shown that man is naturally good. What then can have depraved him to such an extent, except the changes that have happened in his constitution, the advances he's made, and the knowledge he's acquired? We may admire human society as much as we please. It will be nonetheless true that it necessarily leads men to hate each other in proportion as their interests clash, and to do one another apparent services while they're really doing every imaginable mischief. So he's sort of documenting the decline of morality, of that natural goodness he finds in what he calls the savage man, and the decline of that as a result of society and the vanity that promulgates. Anyway, I mean, so there's the philosophy. It's moving in that direction. But for our purposes, it's his confessions that interest us. This is an extraordinary text. It's one of the first autobiographies we have, generically. And it is an extraordinary read. It's hilarious, very moving, and very surprising. Now, of course, we don't know to what extent he's confabulating and making up his memories, and we'll come to this down the track. But at least reads as if he's remarkably revealing about his feelings and his behavior. And he goes right back to childhood. So let's look at a couple of examples from his confessions. So the first thing we're going to see here are some notes I've done for you on Joyce's novel. There we are. So that's just to kind of help you as you read through it. Some of this stuff may be unfamiliar to you. I'm sure it will, because it was to me. And we've got all sorts of weird words that he uses at times, some Latin, but some which are just very sort of embedded in Irish culture. Anyway, I'm just referencing that. Let me now move to back to this, and let's get to Rousseau. Here we are. So this is early in the book and a childhood memory here. Right at the bottom of this page 28, one day I was learning my lessons alone in the room next to the kitchen where the servant had left Mademoiselle Lambercier's combs to dry on the stovetop. Now, when she came to take them off, she discovered that the teeth of one were broken, all down one side. Who was to be blamed for this? I was the only person who'd been in the room, but I said I'd not touched it. So Monsieur and Mademoiselle Lambercier jointly lectured, pressed, and threatened me, but I stubbornly maintained my denial. Appearances were too strong for me, however, and all my protests were overruled. Although this was the first time that I'd been convicted of a downright lie. They took the matter seriously, as it deserved. The mischief, the untruth, and my persistent denials all seemed to deserve a punishment. But this time it was not Mademoiselle Lambercier who inflicted it. They wrote to my uncle Bernard, and he came. And my cousin was accused of another crime, no less grave, and we were awarded the same chastisement, which means punishment, a severe one. So they were unable to force from me the confession they required. And though the punishment was several times repeated, and I was reduced to the most deplorable condition, I remained inflexible. I would have died rather than give in, and I was resolved to. So force had to yield before the diabolical obstinacy of a child. And finally, I emerged from that cruel ordeal shattered but triumphant. This is the important bit for us. It's now nearly 50 years since this occurrence, and I have no fear of a fresh punishment for the offence, but I declare before heaven that I was not guilty. I had not broken, nor so much as touched the comb. I had not gone near the stove, nor so much as thought of doing so. But do not ask me how the mischief occurred. I've no idea, and I cannot understand it. But I do most positively know that I was innocent. Imagine a person, timid and docile in ordinary life, but proud, fiery, and inflexible. A child always controlled by the voice of reason. Imagine the revolution in his ideas, the violent change of his feelings, the confusion in his heart and brain, in his small intellectual and moral being. I say imagine all this if you can. For myself, I do not feel capable of unraveling the strands. So a bit further down, his cousin is with him, and there they are lying together in the same bed. We embraced wildly, and we would give voice to our anger. We sat up and shouted 100 times in unison at the top of our voices, Carnifex, 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 torturer. Here, I feel my pulse beat faster once more as I write. I shall always remember that time if I live to be 1,000. that first meeting with violence and injustice, has remained so deeply engraved on my heart that any thought which recalls it summons back this first emotion. And that feeling has since assumed such a consistency and become so divorced from personal interest that my blood boils at the sight or the tale of any injustice, whoever may be the sufferer. Okay, so we have an event which triggered an emotion that was so intense, in this case of injustice, that this is how he now remembers the event. It's through this emotion. Just one more example for us that comes a bit later. Halfway down here, he's moved on. He's a bit older now. He's working as, I think, a servant or something in another house. And he's talking about the way in which they were moving house. And so he says here, I did not leave her house as I entered it. I took away with me lasting memories of a crime and the unbearable weight of a remorse which even after 40 years still burdens my conscience. In fact, the bitter memory of it, far from fading, grows more painful with the years. Who would suppose that a child's wickedness could have such cruel results? So all sorts of things are happening as they're moving house. But everyone was very vigilant, trying to make sure that nothing went missing. But Mademoiselle Pontal lost a little pink and silver ribbon, which was quite old. Plenty of better things were within my reach, but this ribbon alone tempted me. I stole it. And as I hardly troubled to conceal it, it was soon found. And they inquired how I'd got hold of it. I grew confused, stammered, and finally said with a blush that it was Marion who had given it to me. Now, Marion was a young girl from the Maurienne whom Madame de Vicellas had taken as her cook. And Marion was not only pretty, she had that fresh complexion, but she was a good girl, sensible and absolutely trustworthy. And they were extremely surprised when I mentioned her name. But they had no less confidence in me than in her, and decided that it was important to find which of us was a thief. So she was sent for to face a considerable number of people, including the Comte de la Roque himself. And when she came, she was shown the ribbon. I boldly accused her, and she was confused, did not utter a word, and threw me a glance that would have disarmed the devil, but my cruel heart resisted. In the end, she firmly denied the theft. But she did not get indignant. She merely turned to me and begged me to remember myself and not disgrace an innocent girl who had never done me any harm. But with infernal impudence, I repeated my accusation. The poor girl started to cry, but all she said to me was, "Oh, Rousseau, I thought you were a good fellow. You make me very sad, but I should not like to be in your place." That's it. She continued to defend herself with equal firmness and sincerity, but never allowed herself any reproaches against me. This moderation, contrasted with my decided tone, prejudiced her case. So, in the confusion of the moment, they'd not time to get to the bottom of the business. The Comte de la Roque dismissed us both, contented himself with saying that the guilty one's conscience would not avenge the innocent. I do not know what happened to the victim of my calumny, but she cannot possibly have found it easy to get a good situation after that. The imputation against her honor was cruel in every respect. The theft was only a trifle, but after all, it was a theft. And what is worse, had been committed in order to lead a boy astray. Theft, lying, obstinacy, what hope was there for a girl in whom so many vices were combined? I do not even consider misery and friendlessness the worst dangers to which she was exposed. This cruel memory troubles me at times and so disturbs me that in my sleepless hours I see this poor girl coming to reproach me for my crime, as if I committed it only yesterday. So long as I have lived in peace, it has tortured me less, but in the midst of a stormy life, it deprives me of the sweet consolation. And it brings home to me, indeed, what I think I've written in one of my books, that remorse sleeps while fate is kind but grows sharp in adversity. And finally here, he talks about the memory and says, so the memory tortures me less on account of the crime itself than because of its possible evil consequences. But I've derived some benefit from the terrible impression left with me by the sole offence I have committed, for it secured me for the rest of my life against any act that might prove criminal in its results. And I think also that my loathing of untruth derives to a large extent from my having told that one wicked lie. So, to conclude, how does Rousseau, in this literary text, because that's what this confession is, how does he remember? We have, of course, the childhood memory here, but the answer is in a predominantly amygdala way. Rousseau does not need to see a comb or a ribbon to be taken back to these memories. He doesn't need that visual trigger. That's not how it works. It works like this. When he is terribly upset by something because he sees the injustice of it, he feels the injustice of it, then his memory of this incident with the comb comes back to him. When he is terribly upset because he feels guilty about something, the memory of this event with the ribbon comes back to him. So it's the memory that takes him back. It's the emotion, rather, that connects to the memory. And of course, it's hyperbolic, it's exaggerated, and that very much feeds into the romanticism of the genre here. Okay, enough for today, I think. What we will turn to in the next video is a slightly different approach to amygdalal memory in literature, and focus more on sensations. And we will turn to the poetry of Baudelaire and Lamartine. Okay, thanks for your time, and see you in the next video.